I guess I'm going to call this recording some strange abstract title, something like The Vector of a Solution for South Africa. Now, as I analyze the situation in South Africa, the situation is quite dire because the situation that we're in, if you can even call it a problem, is directly at the feet of the fact that we live in a democracy. So in some sense, we don't have a problem, we just have a democracy. Now, that basic fact being, let's say, the proximate cause of all problems in the country, there's a limit to how much you can criticize, in view of actually trying to come to some kind of solution. Because you can't restrict the franchise, you can't have anything less than universal adult suffrage. So my vector of attack on the situation is that we don't live in a liberal democracy, as is guaranteed by the Constitution, that the liberal nature of our democracy has been eroded and degraded and brought down. And that, in some sense, my view is that the magic bullet that would fix the country is simply if we could get something like the American Supreme Court to be our constitutional court, so that we actually had proper constitutional jurisprudence governing the law and governing politics properly in this country, so that we lived up to our constitution and we lived up to our protections and our guarantees. Because if you stop those violations, you could solve all the problems in the country, basically. I mean, the ANC has been very clever at amalgamating transformation or redress-based policy as the flagship and the Trojan horse that delivers them their ill-gotten gains, their corrupt, their unfettered corruption and the spoils of that kind of insidious way of taking over a system. And the problem is that they have controlled the media so well and controlled the narrative in the media so well in the country that there's just no way to get a liberal argument, a liberal political argument off the ground. Like if you go to Twitter, you can see the ideological clash quite clearly, but you wouldn't see any representation of this in mainstream media news. That the narrative is very tightly controlled. So the problem is that the ANC is both too greedy and too successful at its control and manipulation of the narrative that we can't get a liberal sharp elbow in there to break it up. Now, this is exacerbated, I would say, by the fact that so many particular journalists in and of themselves have been taken over by the ideology of black consciousness and radical, basically black fascist propaganda, that the whole narrative is that white privilege and structural oppression is basically making the world unfair for people, therefore they need special interventions and they need a kind of rainbow Hitler to intervene on behalf of their group and to hand out group redistributions between groups. So just treating society as a statistic of different groups to be morally mediated over by some kind of controlling force, so that they switch government from being the handmaiden of the people to a control organization, to a kind of, supreme socialism. And, we're quite far down that road. And it doesn't look like the population is going to be that amenable to having its political consciousness updated. This strategy is too much of a winning strategy. It just empowers too many black psychopaths to get away with all of their kind of feeble, sadistic, personal psychological strategies. Like a perfect example of this would be Penuel the Black Pen. I mean, this is a black psychopath if you've ever met one. He's just a rabid racialist. He will reinforce the psychopathic arguments of the black fascists on Twitter, for example, and use them to advance his own, sadistic narrative of not feeling, of basically completing the black fascist formula that the system doesn't care for him enough as a representative of his group and isn't giving him enough as a representative of his group, and everyone must just be treated as representatives of their groups. And it's interesting that he should make these observations in a context where quotas have been mandated and black economic transformation has been mandated in a system that has crushed that system's capacity to even grow. To expect an economy to transform when it can't even grow simultaneously, is just, it beggars belief that Penuel the Black Pen can, be so selective in his, kind of application of logic and rationalization, like just how cherry-picked their reasoning is. They don't care how vulnerable they are to counter-narratives because they are just dependent on the fact that those counter-narratives just don't get represented in mainstream media. They just get left unreported. So, this is their basic strategies. They just ignore the counter-narrative and they just keep on repeating the same black fascist line that everyone has to toe. So yeah, we have a very toxic media environment. We have a very toxic political environment. And as it seeks to protect itself, you can see it becoming more toxic. And then it even, it's so dependent on scapegoating all of its many deficiencies and its many failings. It just exports those failings and projects them onto its ideological enemies. It says, well, because you are resisting the black economic transformation, that's why the country isn't growing. As if it's not the government's fault that the economy isn't growing. It's somehow the private sector. So the private sector is expected to both be a government as well as an economy, and it must provide to the people. The private sector is really the scapegoat of the government. It's like, well, why isn't the government doing even more good things? It's because the private sector is failing us. So it's sort of just reinforcing that kind of racial scapegoating conspiracy theory that so I mean, you have to be so close-minded and selective in the facts and the narrative that you're willing to construct in your head in order to follow the narrative of mainstream media. And no one seems to point out just how deranged this is, just how deluded it is. But also that the media itself is just completely conformist with a black fascist agenda and has no space for any kind of liberal commentary. So my whole argument is that we just need to bring liberal values back, and we need to start applying that moral standard to action so that we can start winning the narrative war, winning the PR war, because that's the only way that you get change in a democracy is you have to change opinions, but you can't change opinions if there's no diversity of ideological, if there's no depth in the ideological clash, if there's no, when you live in a proportional representation system in a democracy, politics inevitably becomes ideological, and it's about, now this is the general problem that South Africa falls into, is that we haven't overtly had socialism yet. We haven't gone through the process of setting up a state like Venezuela and having it collapse. So the people themselves don't have experience with socialism. I mean, we've had this kind of growing cancerous ANC control over society, which has been in the name of the socialist revolution, and it's caused devastation, but the narrative scapegoats all the blame for that on whites or non-black participants in the country. And so, it always says that the solution is more of itself. So we've had some exposure to something like socialism, but it's it still seems to be winning the PR war, even as the ANC is losing ground in the polls electorally. You still have over 50% of the vote going to political parties that are basically radical socialists. So, to me, that's a reflection of the fact that we don't have any real liberal voice in political discourse in the country. And that is the solution that I'm trying to focus on, because that's the only long-term solution, is fixing that problem. But also getting international support and getting international intervention along the right ideological lines to help create the right context for showing that there are things lacking, or to show exactly what is lacking in our political structure, in the South African political structure. Now I'll just spend the time emphasizing and repeating myself, because we live in a democracy. All of our problems are basically self-inflicted. The one problem that we shouldn't be suffering from is that we should not have to suffer through corrupt judges and corrupt jurisprudence and a corrupt law, which then has a knock-on effect of corrupting the morality of the political space. And that's why I try to make that argument, because it's a very special argument for understanding how we have been corrupted as a society, that the moral corruption precipitates state corruption, but that state corruption has created a structural kind of fundamental anti-non-racialism. And so we have a judicially sanctioned racialist, black fascist movement in this country. And it's endorsed by the law itself. The racial law itself, the racialized law and the racializing law, gives them tremendous cover to do what they're doing and to promote themselves as being reasonable and correct in their radical and rabid black fascism. So, yeah, we have a very specific kind of structural racism that undermines the Constitution, that is being done in the name of the Constitution. So, these radicals have co-opted a very important social institution, the Constitution. Is really a social institution in our society. And we have to reclaim that. Liberals have to reclaim that. Until liberals do reclaim that, we haven't even found reality. We haven't found political reality. We're not on the ground yet. We haven't found the true floor of the situation. We're up in the air, we're disjointed, we're confused, we're disrupted by black fascists. And until we find bedrock, until we find a solid ground, we're not going to be able to organize any kind of proper fight back or resolution to these problems. So yeah, properly framing the issue and properly framing the pertinent moral issues, I find to be, in the long term, are going to be more important than getting dirtied in the fray of complaining about the right thing and making the right kind of humanitarian appeal, or giving sympathy to people who feel hard done by because they have to endure a system that is racist and unfair. Like going into those sorts of details, I mean, other people can do that. They can make podcasts and they can do those sorts of things. I'm more selective and like to think that I'm focusing on being the most proactive. And if people have different views to me about what would be proactive, then they can go and make their own projects. I'm not stopping anybody else. I'm just making my argument. So yeah, for me, it's very important that South Africa is called out on its liberal double standards, and it can't just use democracy as an excuse for essentially betraying its own constitution and being a constitutional delinquent. So I would say that the unconstitutionality of the South African government renders it an illegitimate government already. That it is an invalid form of racist rule. It contravenes the provisions of non-racialism. I mean, how the jurisprudence was in particular gerrymandered to make racialism work in this country is also particularly disgusting, because it says in the limitations clause of the Constitution, Section 36 of the Bill of Rights, that all rights can only be limited in terms of Section 36. And it goes into A, B, C, D, and E, the listed 5 grounds that must be satisfied for a right to be limited. It has to be limited according to those tests, and those tests were never applied. They were completely short-circuited. They just said, we live in a democracy, and the democracy has produced these racist laws, therefore the court has no room to question them. Importing a kind of American relativism, quite frankly, into our law, which has no place in the South African legal system. We have a supreme South African constitution. It has been that supremacy has been undermined by the Constitutional Court itself. It has given up its own legitimacy. It has made that fascistic play where you just say, well, the democracy said it was okay, so we just get to check that box, and we don't have to substantively see if the law measures up to the standards that are in the law, from the Constitution, issuing from the Constitution. So I don't know if it's worth it for me to go through that particular legal test, but you see, that particular legal test very clearly shows you that Black economic empowerment and the Employment Equity Act of 2008 simply don't meet the requirements in Section 36 to justify the limitation of the non-discrimination clauses in the Constitution. Because even though affirmative action is prescribed in the Constitution, it still has to meet the limitations clause. There's no particular carve out. The Constitution is universal in its application. It can't not be non-universal. So we have this uncomfortable fact that our judiciary has been infiltrated by ideological racialists, and they have infused a kind of black fascist twist into our Constitution into our constitutional order, and they have done so at the expense of the liberal nature of the South African experiment. The South African experiment is meant to be a liberal democracy, and it is certainly no longer a liberal democracy. So the country has failed. It already has collapsed on that conceptual level. So what other countries do to us, I think it's fair game for other countries to intervene as they see fit. We are certainly in need of that because we are effectively, constitutionally speaking, a failed state. I do believe that our constitutional delinquency should have consequences on the sovereignty of South Africa. Certainly the friends of the South African people should step in and do something, and America is at a perfect has a perfect vantage point and opportunity to be such an interventionist. Now, these situations are so complex and hard to navigate, especially when you have a municipal mainstream media that is so biased against liberal thinking and liberal values and liberal principles like individual justice. It's hard to say what actors like, for example, the Democratic Alliance, what their national policy should be in such a turbulent environment. This subject concerns me, obviously, because that seems to be the only liberal party in politics, really, that has up till now sort of stood up for liberal values. But it's very hard to do so in a context where the Overton window is basically controlled by black fascism. So yeah, the whole thing is really just a mess. You have to hope that there's enough geopolitical stress that it shakes up the local politics enough that people will start to radically reappraise, what's been going on in this country and realize, just how morally corrupt it is, but also how unconstitutional it is, and how evil the people are that have been running this greedy, sort of influence peddling racket on the South African people. But at the end of the day, in a democracy, the people are fundamentally accountable for the state of their own democracy. And that's another thing that we might just have to pay political, sort of pay attention to and give proper credence to, that maybe there just aren't enough people in this country who want to live in a democratic, liberal society. Maybe they do want a black fascist government. Maybe that is their wish and they don't care about the Constitution. So, you can't when a country has, as slowly as South Africa degenerated, you can't say that the people, haven't bought their tickets for that ride. I think the people are certainly culpable, especially people like Penuel. There are a lot of liberal black activists and political voices in the alternative media, and I'm very thankful for their existence and their presence and their and how they're trying to spread the message. But when I look at all the kind of lazy and psychopathic efforts that they face and that stand against them, it's certainly demoralizing that we live in a country with so many evil people, with so many morally corrupt people, that, are, just kind of the lazy default black fascist narrative becomes their programming, becomes what they use to base their very lazy rationalizations with. Um, so I mean, until people really stop hating out of the convenience of the racial scapegoating and they start really blaming themselves, I mean, that's really the source of all real power and empowerment, is when you take responsibility, which means blaming yourself for situations and stepping up, and then I guess you become like uh, a liberal uh, trying to spread the message of, cleaner governments, cleaner governance, and cleaner morality for the state. Yeah, I mean, it. I perhaps also need to work out a better way of communicating the differences between the kind of morality that is propagated by identity politics, which is group accountability for your group statistics, like as if that you can be resentful of another group because of its historical agglomeration to power and its historical inherited prestige and privilege, and how that, so you can blame white people for the average white person having a certain socioeconomic condition, but somehow this overshadows and is more important than making your government responsible in a civic nationalism for transformation. We basically, in the Constitution, we have a right to transformation in our society, but somehow this gets transposed, or by some kind of transitive process, this gets put onto white people because government places it on white people. Because instead of actually doing proper transformation policy, instead it just puts out quotas. It just puts out methodology that you have to follow if you're a business. So that kind of government co-option of the private sector means that everything that the private sector does because of transformative policy or redress policy is a win by the state. And if it doesn't win enough, then it's a loss by the private sector. So the private sector becomes pseudo the government. White people become pseudo the prevailing government that everything gets thrown at the feet of, well, white people aren't morally doing their job in the new South Africa. Now, this recalibration from civic nationalism that puts the onus on transformation on the state and that shifts it to, let's say, identity resentment and identity causation, the idea that everything that happens is caused by your identity that you inherit from history. It completely overlooks the duty on the state, and when I say state, I mean government, the duty on the government to actually deliver the transformation. But yeah, so these are the kinds of moral frames that are very much disrupted and confused when you have a liberal order that's been debased. We have an eroded civic nationalism that has transformed into a kind of identity causation that then is used to propel resentment and revenge and vindictiveness in the electorate. And it seems that the electorate isn't capable of overcoming these cheap and convenient emotional avenues to scapegoat responsibility. So we really have an electorate that is openly disempowering themselves by buying into identity politics and cheapening their own vote, as it were. So they will vote for the same people or the same type of people that sell them the same moral narrative and the same moral deal that blames and puts the weight of responsibility at the feet of white people. So, I mean, this is a kind of, but this is how fascist logic always works, is that the narrative is fundamentally disempowering. And so when you feel disempowered, it makes you more resentful and vindictive to do something radical about it. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the more it actually fulfills its own prophecy, it actually generates proof of its own narrative. So, it's this this stuff only gets uncovered if you are willing to look at the premises baked into the narrative and look at what they're subverting from the liberal order and from the liberal paradigm of democracy. So, the ANC has promoted race nationalism so much now that civic nationalism can't even be imagined anymore by people. So, yeah, I mean that's another important juxtaposition to raise: civic nationalism and identity causation. So we really have a democracy that, based on the manifestos of the popular parties in by and large, except for the Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance is the only party that obviously doesn't believe in identity politics and doesn't promote race nationalism. That's about a quarter of the vote. But the other major parties, which make up more than a majority, all promote the sort of the self-disempowering, convenient scapegoat of just racially scapegoating all problems onto non-blacks in the name of identity causation and identity politics. So, yeah, we really have a dysfunctional democracy, which, I mean, I would argue that the real solution to this is that no manifesto should be allowed to include race nationalism. You shouldn't, at the point at which you have a government comprised of political parties whose manifestos include race nationalism, you've already got a constitutionally delinquent government. You've got a constitutional crisis at that point. And so we've had a constitutional crisis basically since 2008, where the ruling party has been race nationalist and included race nationalism in its manifesto. So yeah, this is not stuff that can just be water under the bridge. You have to clear the stuff out. You have to reset these types of factors, or at least address them, or have a plan to address them. So yeah, having a kind of national liberal platform is going to be very hard to establish with all of these vectors and problems. Um, by the way, the reason why civic nationalism is really the key to unlocking transformation in this country is because the government really has the best opportunity. I mean, we have a progressive tax system. So already people who are richer pay more into the system automatically. We want rich people in this country. We don't want to scare them away. We need taxpayers to fund our progressive policies like transformation. I mean, this is why I am always skeptical about people who will complain about rich white people or white people that have supposedly disproportionate share of this or that. Usually they're using incorrect statistics anyway. But, if you actually look at the updated statistics, there's a lot of transformation that has already occurred in the country. The problem is that a lot of this supposed transformation is artificial. It's because it's propped up by mandates, by quotas. It's not organic development. It's not organic transformation. It's not genuine transformation, which is the worst kind of poison that you can feed into a society, which is also why we have problems with the black fascist narrative, is because we have a lot of imposters in their so-called professionals running around pretending to be professionals that they can't really be sure about their credentials because their credentials are so artificially mandated. And they haven't reached those positions in a way where the integrity of the credentials has not been compromised. Anyway, but the reason why I don't like it when people complain about whites this or that proportion of this is because, well, they pay more tax. Therefore, if they are if they're in a higher socioeconomic bracket, they're going to contribute more to the fiscus. And because we have a progressive tax regime, it's if you're complaining about the lack of transformation, it's not the successful person's fault. It's the government's fault for not inducing proper transformation. So it's strange that and I mean it's not as if white people haven't been slowly destroyed by the government. Everyone has been affected by the government's poor performance in controlling the economy and controlling society and the levers of policy, that have restricted investment in the country, that have done a lot of negative things to the country and allowed the country to deteriorate and break down. White people have essentially also been victims of this. And obviously, just because they're not right at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder doesn't means that they can shield themselves from most of the discomfort. But I mean, if you just look at the generational statistics, you can see that, I mean, there's a missing generation. Most non-black people try to leave this country when they start their career, if they can, because they know that there's no future in South Africa. That's the general consensus. I mean, my generation doesn't exist in this country almost. I'm 35 years old, or I'm between 35 and 40. My generation just left this country. So, I mean, I don't know what you call that. I mean, if I wanted to create a sympathetic narrative, I could say, my group, the non-blacks in South Africa, are being slowly ethnically cleansed. That's what the government is effectively doing, which is very stupid because they are by doing that, they're also confining the economy's growth. The more high functioning people that are skilled or talented that, can invest in business in a country, the better off that country will be. But the kind of anti-capitalist toxicity of the rabid racial national socialists, which are basically fascist. I mean that's the definition of fascism, is racial national socialism. Yeah, so what they've got going for them is that they can just scapegoat a minority group of people in the country and somehow get away with any kind of responsibility for developing the country. And when the country doesn't develop, somehow it's not the government's fault, according to the narrative. It's the controlling, white privilege, structural, white monopoly capital boogeyman. So it's a very clever political shift there, a political diversion. And if people are dribbled like that, as Sischler, Big Daddy Liberty would say, you never get democratic accountability from the government. You never get good governance from your government, because you're happy with the diversion. You're happy with the political scapegoating. So it's a very simple and even stupid gimmick. But that single gimmick, you can say, is the capstone of why South African politics on the left side of the spectrum is just so mediocre, is just people peddling their hate and peddling their identity politics narrative in exchange for grift, in exchange for being the political elite that then get to use the black economic empowerment policies to enrich themselves and their well-connected friends. And the people aren't sensitive to that grift. The people just don't care, because they're happy with the emotional vindictiveness that they get against white people. So it's just basic racial hatred manifesting in a slightly in a political way that ends up devastating the country. And the people who really deserve to be blamed for this is the electorate. The electorate deserve their poor performing government, because they voted for their poor performing government, and they keep doing so. And the people that they also vote for are even worse than their poor performing government as well, are more radical and destructive. So, a very lowbrow emotional argument is basically destroying the potential of South Africa, but it's perfectly democratically legitimate, as it were. So, South Africa is exactly where it deserves to be, relatively speaking, to its electorate. You would just hope that electorate would grow up already and get over lowbrow emotional arguments, of being diverted and dribbled by the race hustlers. But that's only going to happen if the media changes, and the media is perhaps only going to change when the international context and framing of the issue changes, because we don't have enough local voice and ability to focus matters. People fighting it out on Twitter, on X, or using YouTube, they're not really going to have the weight that mainstream media does in hammering the narrative and dispelling that narrative, and the racial narrative really does need to be dispelled. But the mainstream media is just too ideologically corrupt. It's too bought by the ANC and by its functionaries. So yeah, South Africa is being ruined by black racism. Black people who are racist are devastating the country. That's my diagnosis, at least. I mean, that's very obvious. And while psychopaths like Penuel just keep on blaming white people because that's all he can do, because he can't take responsibility. And, his mentality is such an oversimplified cartoon of reality that is so poorly tested and that cannot withstand even, the most, just basic facts could be pointed out to Penuel. But I mean, what's the point of engaging in that kind of argument? What's the point of engaging in that kind of fray? I mean, that doesn't get you anywhere. So yeah, trying to frame the issues in South Africa so that, because you have to understand that an American audience, and I am trying to appeal to an American audience because I want to educate Americans about the situation in South Africa in such a way that they would feel confident endorsing political intervention, and that they would feel good about the kinds of pressure that Trump is bringing to South Africa, and just also not just pressure, but just transparency. That's exactly the kind of pressure that South Africa requires if it's going to reform itself and going to reform its liberal ways. So yeah, that is what I am focused on doing. I mean, there are already good organizations in the country that are trying to bring a liberal perspective onto things. The Institute of Race Relations, the Free Market Foundation, they are involved quite a bit in promoting non-racialism in South Africa, but I don't think they have a chance at making real inroads unless we have added international pressure and reframing happening at the same time. That is the reframing of our internal narratives as being, quite racist and quite black fashion, sort of that appreciation that black people can be racist too, that appreciation that black people can be fascist, and some kind of moral stigma attaching to them that it's not okay. So that I think is the general reframing that South Africa needs, and it will only get that from the outside. It can't get that from the inside, because the systems are just too thoroughly corrupted and taken over. The streams of communication, the mainstream media is just, I don't know who owns it all or what sort of umbrella shell corporation, like Prime Media. I mean, I can't think of a single outlet in this country that publishes that is basically infused with liberal thinking. It's all just black, fascist, woke, identitarian racism. So that's it's very troubling. And it is a desperate move requiring outside intervention, but without it, I don't see South Africa going in any other different direction than what it's already going in. It's just going to be more of the same if we don't get some kind of intervening influence over our local politics. So yeah, obviously, even if you want to encourage this, it's hard to, because the American public don't necessarily have an appetite for interventionism. There are a lot of things about the American psyche that you have to, and the American political system that you have to appreciate in knowing the kind of mentality, because why should Americans even care is something that you have to get over, or that's something that you have to surmount, and that you have to find a way of the other thing is that America doesn't have the same appreciation that South Africa used to have, or South Africa had a very strong structural rule of law that I think went underappreciated and not fully understood even about. South Africa doesn't know this about itself. It doesn't realize how other countries are governed very differently in terms of their structure of government. You have to remember that even during apartheid, the legal system in this country could not be brought under the yoke of Parliament. Parliament was felt so confined by the legal system in this country, because the legal system was so independent of the politics, that the apartheid government even tried to set up a high court of parliament to bypass having to be controlled by the high courts in South Africa. And that wasn't validated very quickly by the real High Court in South Africa. Said, you can't do this. You can't set up a High Court of Parliament. So we have a history in this country of having a kind of rule of law that supersedes politics, that is the kind of backbone of our civilization. This is completely alien to Americans, because Americans are used to the idea that the democracy controls the law, whereas we in South Africa actually have a rule of law, that the law is separate and above politics. And that is very alien to Americans. That kind of goes against some principles of freedom. But I would argue that the South African synthesis is a very important synthesis that is necessary for actually having a functioning liberal democracy. Is that without the rule of law, you can't stabilize the liberal nature of a democracy. And so when we had a Supreme Constitution, it was a very important document, I think, for the world, but also for the South African legal system, which I know is all getting repudiated and is getting trammeled and trampled on by the black fascist movement. And that, I hope, is anyway, these factors are relevant. So when I talk to Americans, I do emphasize the Constitution, but that, how our current state of unconstitutionality or constitutional invalidity is more relevant than it would be in other places. But I mean, you can just summarize it as saying that we live in a failed state. Constitutionally speaking, the state has failed. We live in a constitutional crisis that has gone uncommented on by the mainstream media. It's gone unnoticed by the black fascist narrative. So it doesn't even register in our municipal politics, in our local dialogue. And so, I don't know, if I get pushback or kickback from people who don't care about that kind of dry legal analysis, and or they think it's a highfalutin moral line that has been crossed, that's not really relevant, and what's more relevant is the actual day-to-day living of people in this crushing system. I mean, well, other people can make those kinds of humanitarian appeals if they want to. I'm not going to waste my time, also because I just think that democracies all the time vote in solutions that are not solutions and that end up making the problems worse. And we're just another democracy that has chosen a government that is basically not good and that is basically destructive. And I'm trying to distinguish South Africa as not just being one of those democracies, that we do actually have a constitution that should be the supreme law, and that it has been betrayed, and that changes the formula, that changes how outside actors should perceive South Africa as a very particular kind of invalid state. We live in a very particular kind of invalidated, constitutional crisis where there's a fundamental dysfunction that renders the government illegitimate. That's my basic point, which I'm broadcasting to America in particular, but any foreign actors, I think, could also pick up on this and also apply pressure to South Africa, and I hope that they will. Because I think that kind of international pressure and eventually shame will be the only thing that can reframe the internal politics in South Africa. Anyway, I've repeated myself enough, I think.